Your hymns for worship number 7. There's a high hymn, none can compare. No God is equal, no prince is there. Lift up your eyes and see His great might. Soar like an eagle on wings of flight. Saints, lift your voices, the darker days. Lift up your spirit, sing out His praise. Upward the calling, brighter the light. Soaring like eagles on wings of flight. Have you not known Him? Have you not heard? God is creator of all the earth. Lift up your eyes and see His great might. Soar like an eagle on wings of flight. Saints, lift your voices, the darker days. Lift up your spirit, sing out His praise. Upward the calling, brighter the light. Soaring like eagles on wings of flight. Some will grow weary, sin they'll pursue. Servants of God, their power He'll renew. Lift up your eyes and see His great might. Soar like an eagle on wings of flight. Saints, lift your voices, the darker days. Lift up your spirit, sing out His praise. Upward the calling, brighter the light. Soaring like eagles on wings of flight. Now be dismissed to class.
Sorry, it took me a while to get going here. So, Mark chapter 6, that's where we'll be this morning. Mark chapter 6 in our study. It's been a little while. Of course, we had our gospel meeting this past week, but we're going to try to refresh our minds here a little bit and get back into this book, very fast-paced book of Mark. So, does anybody, you're really going to get a gold star here. Is there anybody that remembers what we talked about last time? Mark 5. Todd, you get the gold star, man. Okay. So, I believe, yeah. And we had the casting out of the demons. Now, Matthew says there were 2 men. Mark mentions the one. And Matthew just gives you more information to know that there were 2 men. I think the reason Mark only mentions the one is that's the one he wants to emphasize in this interaction with Jesus. And there's several lessons we were trying to draw from that I think are potential conclusions. It's a very interesting story, an intriguing story. Of course, when Jesus casts the demons out, he has this interchange with them. They know who he is. They don't want to just be cast out. We notice passages that mention or at least strongly imply they needed a host of some kind. And they asked if they could be cast into this herd of swine. He does cast them into the herd of swine. I doubt that they knew they were going to run off into the abyss and that their hosts were going to all die and drown and choke. And that's what happened as a result of those who own livestock. They're asking Jesus to leave. So we know this would have been a Gentile area because Jews didn't want to have anything to do with pigs and swine and hogs. They considered those very unclean. And yet we get some foreshadow that Jesus is going to give Gentiles as well later on through the gospel an opportunity to know him. They don't really want to know him, though. No, they had an opportunity. They could have asked him more questions. They could have asked him about the power that he had. How is this possible? What does this mean? But they're really thinking, I think, probably about their checkbook, and also they're pretty fearful, I'm sure, about this. They just want it to go away. They don't want any more of this going on. So Mark is setting something up, though. We're going to see it again as we move on into Mark chapter. Oh, I do want to get you, Jacob. Hang on to that. Mark is setting something up. We have these crowds that are following him and the common people that are following him. But there are those who are hostile to Jesus. And so the real question is, which group are you going to be in? So as this is written to Christians, they need to know not everybody is going to be receptive. Okay, so we remember the parable of the sower and that kind of thing. Now Jacob had, I think this is where we're going, Jacob. We were talking about, well, how much money are we possibly talking about with this herd of swine? Jacob? Mm-hmm.
We're looking about $2 million.
Okay, a lot of money.
Yeah.
A lot of money. So when you read that, just realize it's not $20 we're talking about here that went off into the abyss. So I thought that was interesting when Jacob and I were talking about it. Major decision that they had to make. They didn't make a good decision in this case. But why is Mark telling? This is what I want you to think about as we move through. Why does Mark tell us? Well, there's a couple of things. There's that choice between materialism and the kingdom of God. There's the whole Gentile-Jew issue. Here he is in a Gentile area, so at least he's willing to go to that area and perform works, which were probably more than what he really did when we're going to look at his hometown today, the city of Nazareth, and there's some interesting things there. So there's all of that that's going on. But again, Mark is setting up a context, I think, to say we're going to see a lot of people that are interested in Jesus. They want to know about Jesus. They may be interested in following Jesus, but you're going to see even more people who are hostile to him. Why is that important for us? To know that today is really no different than the first century in that manner. There are going to be people that you would think would listen. They saw something wonderful and marvelous, and they will not, to such a point that Jesus would marvel at their unbelief. But then there are the unexpected outsiders. Luke does something very similar, who will listen. So these stories are being told in a particular way for a reason. There's a theme, there's a purpose in this when you read through the scripture. Okay, so we saw that last time. We're still in this notion of faith versus fear and the power of Jesus. That's a theme we see a lot. And Mark will do something. Even the enemies of Jesus will ask certain questions about him, and he wants us to think about those questions. Whether they get the answer right or not is kind of beside the point. He wants us to think about who Jesus is as we read through. So let's look at, yeah, go ahead.
Let's go back to the woman with the issue.
Okay.
That's going to come up anyhow, right after this part of it. Okay, I'll wait.
Yeah, okay. All right. Well, if you want to go ahead, go ahead.
Well, as he's talking about it, I was looking at it this morning, and she's healed, it looks like immediately.
Yeah.
But then he tells her later, continue, go in peace and be healed of your affliction. So I was kind of wondering, if she's healed, how can she be healed of her affliction if she's already healed?
Okay. We'll hang on to that and come back. And you'll have the answer to that, of course, when I come back. Okay. Okay. We'll get to that. Maybe, unless I'm going to put you off till next week, but we'll probably get to it. Okay, so, and I also wanted to remind you at the end of Matthew 5, of course we have this, we're going to get into Jairus, but we have this healing that's going to take place. That's interesting as well. So let's read Matthew chapter 5. And give me just a minute. Let's go ahead and read Let's read, we'll get both of these together, 21 through 43. We're going to read quite extensively. Let's do 5 verses at a time. Austin Perry, from starting verse 21, read about 5 verses. Let's see, Stephen Thomas, if you could read the next 5. Clay Dickerson, that 3rd round. Jeremy, the 4th round there, and somebody to finish us up. Richard, if you could just finish up whatever's left. So let's just get this context in front of us. So we're moving from what happened with this herd of pigs and what happened. And remember, the demon-possessed man has been healed. And before we go on, it is interesting, their lack of compassion for him. I mean, amazement at him. It's more like they would rather that demon possession to happen and they're still benefiting from their lives than the other way around. And therefore they don't connect with the greatness of what's happened because they don't even have the compassion that they ought to have. So there's that compassion element too. Okay, let's start.
When Jesus had crossed over again in the boat to the other side, a large crowd gathered around him so that he stayed by the seashore. One of the synagogue officials named Jairus came up, one seeing him, fell at his feet, and implored him earnestly, saying, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Please come and lay your hands on her, and so that she will get well and live." And he went off with him, and a large crowd was following him and pressing upon him. And a woman who had had hemorrhage for 12 years and endured much at the hands of many physicians, and spent all that she had, but it was not helped at all, but rather had grown worse.
After hearing about Jesus, she came up in the crowd behind him and touched his cloak. For she thought, if I just touch his garments, I will get well. Immediately the flow of her blood was dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her affliction. Immediately Jesus, perceiving in himself that the power proceeding from him had gone forth, turned around in the crowd and said, "Who touched my garments?" And his disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing in on you, and you say, 'Who touched me?'"
And he looked around to see the woman who had done this. But the woman, fearing and trembling, aware of what had happened to her, came and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your affliction." While he was still speaking, they came from the house of the synagogue official, saying, "Your daughter has died. Why trouble the teacher anymore?" But Jesus, overhearing what was being spoken, said to the synagogue official, "Do not be afraid any longer, only believe." And he allowed no one to accompany him except Peter and James and John, the brother of James.
They came to the house of the synagogue official, and he saw a commotion, and people loudly weeping and wailing. And entering in, he said to them, "Why make a commotion and weep? The child has not died, but is asleep." They began laughing at him, but putting them all out, he took along the child's father and mother and his own companions, and entered the room where the child was. Taking the child by the hand, he said to her, "Talitha kum," which translated means, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." Immediately the girl got up and began to walk, for she was 12 years old. And immediately they were completely astounded. And he gave them strict orders that no one should know about this, and he said that something should be given her to eat.
Richard, you're going to read chapter 6 in just a minute, okay? Okay. So let's look at these real quick. So Mark also shows there are some people that are among the establishment. You have Jairus, of course, he was a temple official. And notice how he approaches Christ. There's this imploring going on. It's very reverent, very respectful. He seems to have full recognition that Jesus has the power to do this, or I don't see him behaving in this way. And so if you look at chapter 5, the way Jairus comes up to him and seeing him, fell at his feet. So I see Jairus, it's his daughter, and he's begging for her to be healed. And it says in verse 23, he implores him earnestly. Does anybody have a different translation of that, implores him earnestly? Begged, okay. So that's and you can imagine that if you're in his position. And so he implores him earnestly. Now there is something interesting. Do you remember the story of the Gentile centurion? And he had the servant and the way he approached Jesus and said, I know you can just speak the word. Here you have somebody that's more of an insider, you might say, from the temple. That Gentile approached Jesus about the way Jairus approached Jesus. So you see a level of faith and respect. Okay. So he says, my little daughter is at the point of death. Please come and lay your hands on her so that she will get well and live. And he went off with him, and a large crowd is following him and pressing in on him. So really try to get the imagery of the scene. All these people around Jesus pressing in on him. But then we kind of have a little bit of excursion, you might say. But these are related, okay? And we'll talk about what are we learning about Jesus. Just keep asking that question as we move through. So he's going to come back to this incident of Jairus and his daughter. We'll come back to it as well. But as he seems to be on his way, notice what it says. It says there was a woman who had a hemorrhage for 12 years and had endured much at the hands of many physicians and had spent all that she had and was not helped at all, but rather had grown worse. So she had gone to get all the medical treatment she could possibly get. They had done things. It's very frustrating. Not only has she not gotten better, she's gotten worse. You can just imagine how this would have affected her life. Something else from a Jewish standpoint, a woman in this condition, what would she have been considered? Unclean. And so it would have affected her Jewish worship, her being able to go to the temple. See, it wasn't just a physical thing. It was physical, it was psychological, it was emotional, it was relational, it was in some ways very religious for her. And so if you'll notice, this crowd is getting closer to him. They're pressing in on him. And she's thinking, think about this faith that she has. Jairus comes and begs, if you'll just lay hands on my daughter. This woman's thinking, if I could just touch his clothing. If I could just touch his clothing. But that took a tremendous amount of faith on her part. Think about all that she's been through. I don't know how many physicians she had seen, but apparently she saw several. And so, yet there's something different about Jesus. And she's thinking, if I just touch his garments, I might get well. If I touch his garments, I will get well. Now, I'm sure she had heard about what Jesus had done, but now there are those who come to these places. Roger, did you have your hand up?
A question.
Okay.
Is her being unclean, is that a ceremonial? It's not just a ceremonial uncleanness. Is this, what about her being out in the public? Is that something that if people knew her like that, they would shy from her?
Well, they would have shied away from her, yes. So that would have been social too. So relational. It was a ritualistic or a ceremonial uncleanness to be sure, but as far as her experience, to your point, it went further than what we would think of as merely that. So, but you see, we don't sometimes get this, for a Jewish man or woman, to be considered unclean wasn't like we're just going through the motions. I mean, it was a big deal. Okay? So sometimes people will go to these two instances that believe that all you have to do is believe in Jesus, and they'll try to teach faith only. And I'll say a couple of things here. This is not talking about salvation per se. This is talking about healing, number one. Number two, though, neither one of these really had faith only. Now, Jesus is going to say, when he says only believe, what he's saying is entirely rely on me. But look at all that they did. Jairus, what did his faith do? He went and asked Jesus. That's action. Okay, what this woman that had this issue of blood, what did she do? She touched his garment. So even in these contexts, when you think of faith in Jesus, it always involves action. Saving faith does. Saving faith acts. And so even if I went to these passages, I would argue that just reading the text, that what Mark is describing is a faith that relies entirely on Jesus and takes action to surrender to his power and his grace. Now, the way in which we do that now under the new covenant involves some other things, but get the full picture. Mike.
I want to go and add another thing to the woman who had the issue with blood. She had to literally fight to get
Yes,
to him.
that's a good
So
point.
we're talking a tremendous amount of effort on her part. So this woman had an amazing amount of faith.
Yeah. So when when she's healed, she touches his garment, Jesus knows when power has left him. That's interesting. So he knows that, and he says, who touched me? Out of all these people, just try to get, you're in this huge crowd, and they're just pressing. I think the old King James in some places, thronging to him. You know, they're just pressing on him, and all at once he stops his disciples and says, who touched me? They're like, what do you mean who touched you? A whole lot of people are touching you. And so he asks who touched me, and she's very honest. It was me, and tells him the situation. Now, yeah, she knew she had been healed.
She felt it.
Well, think about it. All this time, she's only been getting worse. She believes if I touch him, I'll get well. She touches him, and she gets well. And there's faith in action bringing about healing because of trust in Jesus. That's right down Mark's line. That's what he's trying to get across. Faith in action, in some level of obedience and trust, relying entirely on Jesus. So she thinks if I touch his garments, I'll get well. And immediately the flow of her blood was dried up. And she felt in her body that she was healed of her affliction. Immediately, which is one of Mark's favorite words, but immediately Jesus, perceiving in himself that the power proceeding from him had gone forth, turned around in the crowd and said, who touched my garments? And his disciples said to him, you see the crowd pressing in on you, and you say, who touched me? And he looked around to see the woman who had done this. Now, get that picture too. So you got all these people pressing on him. He says, who touched me? The disciples said, what do you mean who touched me? And he turns and looks right at the woman. So he knew who touched him. And then we go on with it. He says in verse 33, but the woman, fearing and trembling, aware of what had happened to her, came and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. Now I want you to see something. Go back to verse 22 with Jairus. What did he do with Jesus? Fell down at his feet, imploring him. Here she falls down at his feet. So you have this respect and this reverence and this trust. She tells him the whole truth. And he said to her, daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your affliction. Now, my understanding of that, to the question earlier, is I think he's saying, live your life. Enjoy the benefits of your healing. Okay. That healing, it's not like a one moment deal and it's going to stop. This healing is ongoing for the rest of her life. So enjoy this ongoing condition of being healed. Live your life again in this healing. And so when God heals us spiritually, his intention is not just a one moment in time thing and we go back to living like we did. It's a transformation of a life. Okay. I had some hands. Kelton?
Bruce, do you think there may be something going on here with Jesus wanting the crowd to know what happened? Apparently no one else knew that a healing had happened. Jesus asked who touched my garments. So it may be a parallel to when he raised Lazarus from the dead in the grave. And
Yes.
he said, I thank you that you hear me. I know you hear me, but I say this
For their
so it
benefit.
goes around.
Yeah, I'm sure. Because I doubt Jesus was ignorant of who had touched his garment because he turns right around and looks at her. But it allowed him, especially his disciples too. But you have this multitude, and he's on his way to help Jairus and his daughter. Yeah, it's a perfect time for that to happen. Okay. What did you say, Roger?
It also gave her the opportunity to express herself.
Yeah.
I mean, to confess what she had done.
Yeah.
Which is
Yeah, yeah. And show her faith, because that's his point. But that's demonstrated to whoever would hear. Alan, did you have your hand up?
Thinking about these two individuals here, the way you're going to talk about Jairus Moore, they're both in terrible situations. I mean, one's losing his child, and she's got this terrible affliction, like for 12 years, and that, particularly in the case of Jairus, motivated by this terrible situation, motivated by tremendous pressure to approach Jesus. I mean, a leader of the synagogue.
Yeah, it would not have been looked at too well.
That probably completely destroys his social network. I mean, it could destroy his commerce.
Yes.
Whatever. I mean, the barriers to him to do that are just hard for us to imagine.
Let's hang on to this for a minute. Remember when we studied chapter 3 and that whole controversy when the Jews said he's empowered by the devil? And we talked about how absurd that was. That's how hostile, and you'll see that throughout Mark. But the intensity, if you could just imagine the climate, if you're associated with the temple, if you're part of the religious leadership, and then they find out that you went to him for healing, that you fell at his feet, that you implored him, and they hate him. So you do see. Now I will say, before we get to the end of Jairus, let's go back to what Alan mentioned, but there's two things here I wanted us to think about. Again, let's go back to this question as we're reading through. What do we learn about Jesus? Jesus is described as the great physician, not only physically, we see it physically, but that really points to him spiritually healing us. Sin is often described as a plague, as basically a self-afflicted condition by our choices. But still, he's offering to heal and restore and renew. Okay, so there's that. Then with Jairus, there's going to be him resurrecting the dead, but he not only resurrects the physical dead, he resurrects the spiritual dead. When in the story, going to the story of Lazarus, remember what he says there. To them, I am the resurrection and the life. Well, this miracle confirmed his claim to be able to heal spiritually. See, when we go back in Mark's account and if we were to think about the man that was healed, and then Jesus said, your sins be forgiven you, and he said, which is easier for me to say your sins be forgiven you or get up and walk? What was the miracle about? Showing that the Son of Man had power on earth to forgive sins, he said. So I think when we read these, the question is, what do I learn about Jesus from these? Because that's what Mark's really trying to get after. But we do also see his compassion. He didn't heal all the sick. He didn't raise everybody that died. But you see the compassion and the desperation. I mean, these instances show us the desperation of being outside of Jesus, the desperation of being in sin, the real condition we're in without the Lord, and then his power to heal, his power to restore, and his power to resurrect. Okay, go ahead, Todd.
I wonder what people today, I don't think it says, thought of this woman that had the issue.
I don't.
I think back to Job and his friends, what they thought of him.
Oh, that's a good point.
And I just wonder, I'm reading something in the text here, it's not there, but
I don't think
you
so.
make it assume that, and this woman's been sick for, what was it, 12 years?
12 years. So has she done something?
She done?
Well, now, there's a really good possibility of that because that's what the Jews thought traditionally. If you look at John 9, do you remember the blind man? In John 9, and Jesus is going to heal the blind man, but his own disciples said, was this what his parents did or what he did? They didn't even, and Jesus says neither, but that the glory of God could be shown. So I think the possibility that there were false notions of her uncleanness, very much so. And this fits too, when you read Matthew's account, Jesus touching the leper, not just healing the leper, but touching the leper who would not have been touched in a long time. So a lot of this, Jesus' compassion, Jesus' authority, Jesus' salvation, all of this is coming out in this. Kimberly.
That area where she was afraid and he told her daughter, your faith has made you well, go in peace and be healed. It almost feels like when she felt like she maybe had
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so he's like maybe showing us that it's never wrong to reach out to him now.
Right, right.
He gave her permission after she had done it without his knowledge that you're okay. Go and be healed.
Right. To that point, and going back to what Todd and putting those together, and I don't want to just read too much into it, but all of this fits with what we know about the culture and the context. The way she's afraid, it does make you wonder. How had she been treated? What had been said to her? Had they said, man, every doctor around has tried to heal you. There's something wrong with you. What have you done? You know, it wouldn't surprise me if that hadn't happened. And then when he says, and she also, it's not like she came up to Jesus and said, please heal me. She kind of did it under the table in a way, you know, and that might be her fear from before. And so when she touches him and he says, who touched me? She may think, oh no, because she knew she'd been healed. But then you're right, when he comes back and basically says, be healed, you know, live your life. And he compliments her for her faith and her trust in him. So those are good points. So we're on the way to Jairus. All this has happened and he hasn't even gotten there yet. So notice let's go to verse 35. And while he was still speaking, they came from the house of the synagogue official saying, your daughter has died. So he had asked, he says, she's really sick, she's nearing to death. And they come and say, she's died. Why trouble Jesus with this? So let's just move on to those who haven't died yet. And verse 36 says, but Jesus, overhearing what was being spoken, said to the synagogue official, do not be afraid any longer, only believe. His point is, don't expend your energy in fear. Trust me. Believe in me. Okay. And I'm sure the people there are thinking, what is he talking about? And there's this big crowd. Verse 37, he allowed no one to accompany him except Peter and James and John, the brother of James. Now, even when you have all of those who would be apostles, Peter, James, there was an inner circle of the group. I mean, which is interesting because there was a lot of partiality and jealousy sometimes, but Peter, James, and John seem to be that inner circle. So you have these men, and some of them are going to be apostles, but you have Peter, James, and John mentioned quite a bit. Now, by the way, who's Mark connected to? Which apostle is he connected to? Peter. So he mentions this quite a bit. Verse 38, they came to the house of the synagogue official and saw a commotion, the people loudly weeping and wailing, and entering in, he said to them, why make a commotion and weep? The child has not died, but is asleep. And they began laughing at him. Can you think of another instance where that is almost replicated? Lazarus, remember, he was sick. It's the same thing. He was sick, and he didn't get in a hurry. And he says to his disciples, he's sleeping. Jesus didn't talk about him taking a nap. That's what they thought at first. And so very similarly, he says, you know, everything's going to be okay. The child has not died, but is asleep. And they began laughing at him, but putting them all out, he took along the child's father and mother. Now think about this if you're the parents. So they're laughing at him like he's insane. And he just puts them outside. He takes the father and mother and his own companions, Peter, James, and John. He enters the room where the child was. And taking the child by the hand, he said to her, Talitha cum, which translated means, little girl, I say to you, get up. Now here's Mark's word again. And by the way, it didn't take 6 weeks for this to happen. These miracles were immediately, instantaneously. Okay, this was not natural healing that we're going to say is miraculous. He says immediately the girl got up. So just imagine if you're the parents and your daughter has died. And he takes her hand and says, get up. And she gets up. She's 12 years old. So the little girl gets up, and immediately they were completely astounded. But what does he tell them to do here, verse 43? We talked about this before. What does he tell them to do? Don't go tell everybody. The time will come when it will be proclaimed, but don't go tell everybody. We've talked about why that might be. And it's something I noticed in the reading of this, which was kind of interesting to me, is the small details and concern he had for the little girl. What does he say? Give her some food. Let her eat, which, by the way, is also an evidence. She's been raised, and she make sure she's okay and give her some nourishment and that kind of thing. Alan, go ahead.
People not to say anything, but it's so notable.
Yeah.
It's just, I think probably what he's demonstrating is, as you said, it's not yet time for him to openly proclaim what's going on. But, I mean, these people saw that she was dead, they were laughing, so it's going to spread out.
Yeah. When she walks out the door, they see her eating a meal. Yeah.
I think, like you said, it's just more illustrative of the point that this is not yet time for him to openly proclaim.
Yeah. It's going to get out anyway, but not at the level. That's right. Go ahead, Tom.
I'm curious, where Jesus says the child has not died, she is just asleep. Is there a reason for that? Because physically she had actually died. I mean, I'm wondering why he wouldn't just say watch and delete. That's kind of always struck me as
I believe he says that about Lazarus too, even though he had passed. I think, which is interesting because sometimes death is described as being asleep, obviously. But I think the notion is, as far as he's concerned with his power, it's no different than if she were just sleeping. It's like waking somebody up from a nap to minimize the power of death. But that's a good question because she had died. But it seems to me he's trying to show that his power over death it's as if she's only sleeping to him. This insurmountable mountain that feels like we can't get over to Jesus, just like waking you up from a nap. So, Alan, where are you going? Oh, okay. All right. So, Mark's going to keep us going. So you have, in chapter 5, you have healing and you have resurrection. So that goes in Jesus' column. Now, chapter 6, Richard, you've been waiting this whole time. Here we go. So I just want to read chapter 6 and verses 1 through 6.
Then he went out from there and came to his own country, and his disciples followed him. And when the Sabbath had come, he began to teach in the synagogue. And many hearing him were astonished, saying, "Where did this man get these things? And what wisdom is this which is given to him, that which mighty works were performed by his hands? Is this not the carpenter, the son of Mary, and the brother of James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon? And are not his sisters here with us?" So they were offended at him. But Jesus said to them, "A prophet is not without honor except in his own country, among his own relatives, and in his own house." Now he could do no mighty work there, except that he laid his hands on a few sick people and healed them. And he marveled because of their unbelief. Then he went about the villages in a circuit, teaching.
Okay, thank you. We get some really good information here too. So he's going to come back to Nazareth. Nazareth, he doesn't explicitly mention, but we know that's where he is. So let's remember Mark's target audience here. Not that he didn't want Jews to know about this, but his target audience are Gentiles. And you can kind of tell this from some various things. We've seen that he has been rejected by some. The Jewish leadership, the Herodians, his own family, the Gentiles with the pigs, and now even his hometown. Yet there are all these others that Jairus sure didn't reject him. The woman that was issuing blood didn't reject him. Plenty of others aren't rejecting him. But there's something interesting. His own rejected him. His own creation ends up rejecting him. His own people, the Jews, reject him. So there is some foreshadowing of the crucifixion, and also there's this sense that the marginalized and the excluded are the ones really pursuing Jesus, that are depending upon him. It also is declaring the work of Jesus as servant. Think about Philippians 2, that he made himself of no reputation. Now he quotes what seems to be a very familiar statement in Greek and Jewish literature. Notice it there, a very well-known verse there. A prophet is not without honor except in his hometown and among his own relatives and in his own household. Why is that the case? Why would people that haven't known you your whole life be more accepting? Go ahead. Okay, yeah, all right. Tom?
It has to do with reputation and what your occupation is and what how you're put up, whether or not you're put up on a pedestal because of, different things. If Jesus hadn't been a carpenter, if he'd been they were expecting, it goes back to this, that one of the main reasons that the Jewish people, and especially the leadership, did not accept Jesus, there were a lot of reasons, jealousy and a lot of different things, but they were expecting this great, powerful person who would be over an actual army, and this tremendous leader that everybody could see, he was just, magnificent. And so to think of him, as a carpenter, and aren't these men his brothers? Aren't his sisters still with us?
Well, and yeah, to go with some of that, I want you to, now, Mark doesn't talk about in the beginning the virgin birth, but I think he implies it here very subtly. They said, isn't he the son of Mary? I don't think that's a compliment. I think we know him. He's a carpenter. He works with his hands. He's not one of us. He's not the elite. He hadn't, now he would have received a normal Jewish education, and they're even going to ask, where's this wisdom coming from? So it's not that they're not seeing it, but they're not wanting to see it. We watched him grow up. Our kids went to school with him. Mary, and she would have been, even though it was a virgin birth, many people would have thought she had been immoral in some way. And so you've got all of this going on. They're not wanting to see it. And often even today, people that don't know a person, I've even seen this with gospel preachers. Like where you're from will be supported. It's not always that way, but I've just seen, or people that are successful in their career in some way, people that haven't watched them grow up, they just have a different feel. They see it for what it really is. They don't have that baggage or background. So all of this, and then you might have had, siblings who are jealous of this attention he's getting. So there could be a lot of things. Roger, did you have your hand up?
I've often thought that since his brethren, his physical brothers didn't believe him. I mean, think about it. Hey, look, I played the sand with you.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah. You're not special. We're
It does make you wonder, though, what did they think about what Mary would have known? Did they know? Did they talk about it at all? I mean, I would think there were a lot of things. Now, look at these questions. They actually reveal the theme of the book, these questions. Where did this man, and we'll talk about this next time, where did this man get these things? These things he's teaching. It couldn't just come from Jesus. Where did he get these things? What is this wisdom given to him? I mean, it's almost like they don't want to admit the logical source of these things. Such miracles as performed by his hands. Then here comes the skepticism. Is not this the carpenter, the son of Mary, catch that, and brother of James and Judas and Simon? Are not his sisters here with us? So here's what we feel like we know. Here's what this is leading us to think, but that can't be because we know who Jesus is. That's what's going on. We'll come back to that next week.